It was the morning after the storm, December 8, 1941. Radios across America crackled to life. People gathered around, coffee cups trembling in their hands. Overnight, peace had died, and the United States had awakened to war. The sun rose quietly over American towns and farms that Monday morning. Children were getting ready for school. Workers were on their way to factories. Newspapers still carried yesterday's headlines. Japanese envoys meet U.S. officials in Washington. No one yet knew that those same envoys, countrymen, had unleashed hell in the Pacific just hours before. By dawn, the news had spread. Pearl Harbor has been attacked. For millions of Americans, it didn't feel real. Mothers wept at breakfast tables. Fathers clenched their fists in silence. Radio announcers repeated the same words again and again. This is not a drill. From Hawaii to New York, disbelief turned to horror. No one could imagine that the mighty Pacific Fleet, the symbol of America's power, now lay burning beneath the waves. Battleships that once ruled the seas were gone. Smoke rose from the wreckage of the Arizona and the Oklahoma. Young sailors, trapped below deck, had no chance to escape. At the White House, President Franklin D. Roosevelt sat still and pale as telegrams poured in. Reports of ships destroyed, aircraft sunk, thousands dead. He whispered to his secretary the words that would echo through time. This is a date which will live in infamy. Outside, snow began to fall lightly over Washington, D.C., but inside the White House, the air was heavy with fury and grief. America had been attacked not on a distant battlefield, but in its own waters, and the nation's heart was breaking. Across the country, people gathered in churches and town squares. Some prayed for the dead, others demanded revenge. Flags flew at half-staff, but anger burned brighter than sorrow. Men lined up outside recruitment offices, their faces set with determination. Teenagers who'd never seen the ocean rushed to join the Navy. Farm boys, factory workers, college students, all ready to fight. In that single morning, America changed forever. The isolation, the debates, the hesitation, gone. The sleeping giant had awakened, and it would not rest again until victory was won. Factories that once built cars began turning out tanks and bombers. Women rolled up their sleeves and took over the assembly lines. Every citizen felt the weight of the moment, that the future of freedom itself depended on them. The morning of December 8th wasn't just another dawn. It was the rebirth of a nation, forged in shock and sorrow. And as Roosevelt prepared to address Congress, every radio in America was tuned in. Families huddled together in silence, waiting for the voice that would define their destiny. The speech would last only 7 minutes, but its echo would rally millions. And from that day forward, the world would never be the same again. Morning light filtered through the windows of the White House. Inside, every hallway buzzed with urgency. Telephones rang endlessly, secretaries hurried with papers, and military officers waited for orders. At the center of it all sat Franklin D. Roosevelt, calm, composed, but burning inside. He knew that in a few hours, he would face the nation. He had to find words that would not only speak of sorrow, but awaken a sleeping giant. Roosevelt picked up his pen and began to write. Each word was slow, deliberate, heavy. He didn't want poetry. He wanted power. Words that would pierce the heart of every American listening. Across the room, his advisors watched in silence as he wrote the line that would define history. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Outside, the world was already changing. In Hawaii, smoke still rose from the shattered remains of Pearl Harbor. Rescuers pulled bodies from the blackened water, searching for anyone still alive. The air smelled of oil, salt, and fire. Ships that once shone with pride now lay broken, twisted metal monuments to betrayal. Back in Washington, reporters crowded outside the Capitol building. America's pulse was racing. Would Roosevelt declare war? Would the world finally see the United States step into the flames of global conflict? At exactly 12:30 p.m., Roosevelt stepped before Congress. He gripped the podium firmly, his hands trembling just slightly. The room fell silent. Not a cough, not a whisper. Then his voice rose, deep and steady. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The words rolled like thunder through the chamber. Men leaned forward, women clutched handkerchiefs, and reporters scribbled furiously. Every sentence was a hammer strike, a vow that America would no longer watch, no longer wait, no longer hide behind oceans. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people, in their righteous might, will win through to absolute victory. Cheers erupted through Congress. Lawmakers stood, shouting, "Yes, yes." Even the press, bound by objectivity, couldn't hide the emotion in their eyes. For the first time in years, America was united not by fear, but by fire. Within an hour, Congress voted. Only one voice, one single vote stood against the declaration of war. The rest, all 388 others, stood shoulder to shoulder behind their president. The message was clear to the world. America was no longer the observer. It was now a warrior. That afternoon, Roosevelt signed the declaration with a steady hand. Outside, crowds gathered, waving flags, singing the national anthem. Church bells rang across cities and small towns. The United States had entered World War II, and the world would never be the same again. The declaration of war spread across America faster than the winter wind. By nightfall, every radio station was replaying Roosevelt's speech. In homes, cafes, and army barracks, people stood in silence, listening, absorbed, realizing that their lives had just changed forever. Across small towns and big cities, a wave of determination rose. The same men who had spent the Great Depression struggling for jobs now lined up to fight. In New York, recruiting stations overflowed. In Texas, farm boys said goodbye to their families and rode to town on dusty trucks to enlist. In California, men who had never even left their hometowns packed their bags for war. The numbers were staggering. Within days, more than 100,000 Americans volunteered for service. Factories that had once made washing machines and cars now thundered day and night, building tanks, planes, and ammunition. For the first time, the sound of industry became the heartbeat of a nation preparing for battle. In Detroit, Henry Ford's factories were transformed overnight into war machines. Rows of women in overalls took the places once held by men. Their hands were blistered, but their spirits were unbreakable. Posters went up across America, "We can do it." And a new symbol of strength was born, the American worker. Meanwhile, in schools and homes, mothers tried to stay strong. They sewed uniforms, packed letters, and prayed in silence every night. Children drew pictures of airplanes and soldiers, telling their fathers they'd win the war and come home soon. It was a time of fear, yes, but also of purpose. In Hollywood, movie studios stopped making glamorous films. Instead, they made documentaries, war training reels, and patriotic stories. Actors became soldiers. Singers went on tour to raise morale. Everyone wanted to do something, anything for the cause. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces were advancing fast. Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines were under attack. It felt like the world itself was on fire. But in that darkness, something powerful was forming. An American resolve forged in pain, pride, and unity. By Christmas 1941, just weeks after the attack, millions of letters poured into Washington from across the country. Some were from farmers offering their land for airfields, others from students asking to join the army early. Even children sent coins to help soldiers buy supplies. The spirit of America was no longer asleep. It was awake, alive, unstoppable. In a speech later that month, Roosevelt said, "We are fighting not only for our country, but for all mankind, for freedom itself." Those words echoed in every heart. From the crowded streets of Chicago to the quiet barns of Kansas, people understood. This was no longer just about revenge. It was about defending the world from tyranny. The nation had answered the call, and soon, the men and women of America would carry that call across oceans, across continents, into the very heart of war itself. By early 1942, the echo of December 8th had turned into the roar of engines and the marching of boots. America had officially entered World War II, and it was preparing to strike back. Across the Pacific, Japan continued its rampage. The Philippines were under siege. British ships burned in the South China Sea. Guam and Wake Island had fallen. The Empire of Japan seemed unstoppable. But in America's heart, something unshakable had been born. Factories never slept. Men trained through freezing nights. And every newspaper headline shouted one word: revenge. In the skies over California, new pilots were learning to fly faster, fight harder, and never give up. In the shipyards of New York, steel sparks lit up the night like fireworks as new warships took shape. Every hammer strike was an answer to Pearl Harbor. Every bullet produced was a promise that America would rise again. General Douglas MacArthur, trapped in the Philippines, radioed a final message to his troops: "I shall return." Those 3 words became a symbol of faith for millions. No matter how dark the war became, America would not surrender. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, Japan celebrated its early victories. Its leaders believed the Americans would tire quickly, that democracy was too weak to endure a long war. But they had misunderstood the soul of a nation awakened by tragedy. In March 1942, the first waves of American forces began their long journey across the Pacific. The smell of salt, oil, and fear mixed with determination aboard the ships. Young soldiers stared into the dark horizon, unsure of what waited for them, but ready to face it. And then came the moment that would change everything: the Doolittle Raid. April 18, 1942, 16 American bombers took off from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, a daring mission never attempted before, to strike the heart of Tokyo itself. The chances of survival were slim. The pilots knew they might not return, but they went anyway. Their flight across the cold Pacific was silent, tense, heroic. Hours later, the skies above Tokyo roared with the thunder of American engines. Bombs fell on the city that had believed itself untouchable. It wasn't a large attack. It didn't destroy Japan's war power, but it did something great. It shattered the illusion of invincibility. For the first time, the Japanese people looked up and realized the war had come to them. Back home, when the news broke, America erupted with pride. Crowds cheered in the streets. Newspapers called it America Strikes Back. For a nation still grieving, it was hope. Living, breathing hope. The men who flew that mission became heroes. Their courage reminded the world that freedom does not surrender if it fights back. By summer, America's armies were ready. The Pacific would soon witness the turning point of the war, a battle that would decide the fate of nations. The world had awakened the American giant, and now, it was about to feel its power. June 1940, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the United States stood at the edge of destiny. Its navy was battered but not broken. Its people, hardened by loss, were ready to fight back. The Japanese Empire believed it still held the advantage. Their plan was bold: lure what remained of the U.S. Pacific fleet into a trap near a small, remote island called Midway. If they could destroy the last American carriers, the Pacific would belong to Japan forever. But fate had other plans. American intelligence, a small team of brilliant codebreakers, had cracked the Japanese naval code. They knew the attack was coming. They knew where it would happen. And for the first time in the war, the hunters would become the hunted. On June 4, 1942, the skies above Midway exploded into chaos. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft roared through the clouds, dropping bombs onto the island. But far out at sea, 3 American carriers waited: the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown. As the Japanese fleet focused on the island, American dive bombers appeared high above them, unseen, unheard, unstoppable. The sky filled with the sound of engines and the whistle of death. In just minutes, 4 of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were burning. Each explosion shook the ocean and the empire that had believed itself invincible. Sailors leaped into the water as flames devoured steel. Planes crashed into the sea, black smoke rising into the blue Pacific sky. The battle that was supposed to end America had instead broken Japan's naval backbone. When the radio message reached Washington, silence filled the room. Then came a cheer that echoed across the entire country. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, America had won, and not just a battle, but the momentum of the war itself. Roosevelt addressed the nation again. His voice carried both pride and sorrow as he said, "We will not rest, we will not tire, we will not stop until freedom reigns again." In small towns and big cities, the news spread like wildfire. Church bells rang, newspapers printed in bold, "Victory at Midway." But the people didn't celebrate for long. They knew this was just the beginning. The victory came with a cost. Many young pilots who had taken off that morning never returned. Their planes sank into the ocean, their names written only in memory. But their sacrifice had turned the tide of history. From that day forward, Japan would fight defensively, and America, the nation that awoke on December 8th, would march across the Pacific, one island at a time, toward ultimate victory. Midway was more than a battle. It was proof that courage and faith could rewrite fate itself. It was the moment when the world realized the sleeping giant was no longer asleep. It was wide awake and unstoppable. The war that began on December 8th, 1941, would rage for long years. From the islands of the Pacific to the shores of Europe, millions would fight, and millions would fall. But for America, everything changed with that awakening. The morning when peace was shattered and purpose was born. After Midway, the road to victory was long and brutal. Battles like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa would test the soul of every soldier and sailor. Each island was soaked in blood, each victory paid for in lives. But step by step, mile by mile, the United States moved closer to Japan. Factories at home thundered without rest. Women built aircraft faster than they could be flown. Children collected metal scraps to help the war effort. Even in the darkest hours, the American spirit refused to break. In 1944, the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy. While the Pacific raged, Europe, too, began to crumble under the weight of freedom's advance. America was fighting on two fronts, and for the first time in modern history, democracy was stronger than tyranny. Then, in August 1945, the war reached its terrible climax. 2 atomic bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, cities erased in seconds, tens of thousands of lives lost in blinding flashes of fire and light. The world stood still, and on September 10, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, Japan signed its unconditional surrender. The war was over, but as the smoke cleared, America was not the same nation it had been before the attack on Pearl Harbor. It had seen the worst of humanity and the best. It had discovered its strength, but also its cost. Millions of young men returned home changed forever. Some carried medals, others carried memories too heavy to speak of. Families rebuilt their lives, holding on to photographs of those who never returned. In quiet cemeteries across the country, flags fluttered above endless rows of white crosses. Yet out of that grief, a new world was born. The United States emerged as a global power not because it wanted to conquer, but because it had proven that freedom could endure even in the darkest of nights. Roosevelt did not live to see the final victory, but his words still echoed across the generations. We have learned that our strength lies not in the weapons we build, but in the hearts of those who believe in liberty. And so, the morning of December 8th, 1941, became more than a date in history. It became a symbol of awakening, of unity, of sacrifice. From that moment on, America would never again be caught unprepared. It would never again sleep while danger gathered in the distance. The world had changed forever, but so had the people who lived through it. For every mother who wept, every soldier who fought, every citizen who hoped, their courage became the foundation of peace. The morning America awoke to war was also the morning it discovered who it truly was. Sound of wind blowing, radio static fades in. The sun had barely risen on December 8th, 1941, when America transformed forever. All across the nation, flags were lowered to half-mast, schools closed, factories stopped, and in living rooms, people kneeled beside radios, whispering prayers they'd never spoken before. President Roosevelt's voice echoed across the airwaves once more, calm, steady, but with the weight of millions on his shoulders. He told the American people that their sons, their brothers, their husbands, would now fight for freedom, for peace, for a world that would never forget this day. In the Pacific, American survivors still clung to hope. On the island of Oahu, the smoke still rose from the burning hulls of the Arizona and the Oklahoma. Rescue teams worked through the night, cutting through twisted steel, listening for faint cries that faded with every hour. One sailor, trapped inside a compartment deep within the Arizona, used a wrench to tap a message on the metal walls. Each tap a heartbeat of defiance, each sound a reminder that even in death, the American spirit refused to surrender. Across the Pacific Ocean, Japanese leaders celebrated victory, but among their admirals, there was a chilling silence. Admiral Yamamoto, who had planned the attack, wrote in his diary, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." And he was right. Factories began roaring to life. Women joined the workforce. Posters declared, "We can do it." And America answered. Young men lined up at recruiting offices from New York to Los Angeles. In just 24 hours, the country had gone from peace to total war. But amid the noise of vengeance and the promise of justice, there were tears, there was silence, and there was remembrance. For every star that hung in a window, there was a family left behind. For every flag raised high, there was a name never spoken again. December 8th. 1941. It wasn't just the morning America awoke to war. It was the morning America awoke to destiny. On that cold December morning, the world stood divided. But within the hearts of millions of Americans, something new was born. It wasn't anger alone. It was unity. A promise whispered between neighbors, between soldiers and strangers, that freedom would never again be taken for granted. In the White House, President Roosevelt sat by the fireplace, his glasses glinting in the dim light as he read letters from across the nation. Mothers writing that they had lost sons, but would send another if needed. Children sending coins for the war effort, and soldiers writing from Pearl Harbor, vowing that the fallen would not be forgotten. "We will not surrender," one letter read. "We will rebuild. We will rise. And when we return, the world will be free again." Outside, the winter wind swept across Washington, D.C. The American flag, still torn from the previous day's storm, fluttered against the gray sky, a symbol of pain, yes, but also of defiance. In factories, sparks flew as men and women worked side by side. In towns, people gathered in churches, whispering the names of the lost. And far away in the Pacific, the first American ships began their long journey toward revenge. A journey that would last 4 long, brutal years. But history would remember December 8th, not as a day of despair, but as the day the world changed course. Because when the Japanese struck at Pearl Harbor, they did not destroy America, they forged it. They awakened a spirit that would go on to liberate continents, defend democracy, and rebuild the world from ashes. When the war finally ended in 1945, veterans returned home with haunted eyes and heavy hearts. Yet in every town square, in every flag raised to the wind, there was one memory that refused to fade. The morning of December 8, 1941, the morning America awoke to war and found within itself the power to endure, to fight, and to rise again. Long pause. Music swells softly, and as the last radio broadcast faded into silence, one message echoed across the airwaves, from Roosevelt's voice, from every mother's heart, from every soldier's grave. Freedom is never free, but it is always worth fighting for.